I'm Del Howison, owner of Dark Delicacies, the home of horror in Burbank, California. And I'm joined today by Peter Bracke, the author of Crystal Lake Memories, the complete history of Friday the 13th. This book is absolutely beautiful, a coffee table tome to a movie series that some would think of as a B series. What prompted you to write this in the first place?
The original idea for the book was going to be very small. It was just going to be like a small little paperback, and maybe I interview like 5 or 6 people, and wouldn't that be fun? And what happened was when I started the book and started interviewing people, there was just this groundswell on the web of people that when I kind of put out there, hey, I'm starting this book, you know, I'm trying to find people from the films. Suddenly I got just tons of emails and message forum posts from fans saying, oh, we're dying for some information on the series, because at the time there was no DVDs, there was no anything on them. So slowly but surely over the course of 3 years, I ended up interviewing over 200 folks from the series.
So with all the material you gathered for putting this book together, the book could have been much thicker.
Probably the greatest part of the book for me was finally, kind of getting to go down to Paramount, and they said, hey, we have all these boxes labeled Friday the 13th. We haven't looked at them in 20-odd years. Just go for it. So I got to comb through just boxes and boxes of slides and photographs and rare documents and things covered in soot and dirt. And finding the stuff was terrific, because as a fan, you're so used to seeing the typical PR photos that have been recycled a million times in magazines, and that was what the fans were used to. So there was just, thousands of slides that had never been seen.
So when you approached the subject, did you do it from the viewpoint of a fan or as that of an expert? Or did you become an expert in putting the book together?
Well, I felt like I was a huge fan starting the book, and then I became an expert doing the book. But I definitely looked at it from more of a historian point of view. Like, why were these films important? I didn't want to do, an ode to the gore or just a book of, fan musings. It really had to be like, how did this happen? Why did this franchise go from sort of this meat and potatoes drive-in film and become this huge, cash cow, cottage industry? 11 films, from a guy in a hockey mask. That's, it's kind of unheard of in cinema. So I just made an outline. I just kind of sat and picked all the important points.
So Friday the 13th, the whole series was actually part of the second golden age of horror after the Universal of the 30s and 40s. What was the actual genesis of this thing, and how did it come about? It was at the forefront of that drive.
I think the great happy accident of Friday the 13th is that when the film was done, Sean Cunningham was able to show it to some major studio distributors. And one of those was Paramount Pictures, who recognized the commercial value in the film. And suddenly they took this little small pot boiler, and it kind of elevated it up to the level of an A picture by giving it a mass market media campaign. They opened it wide in like over 1,000 theaters, I believe, which was huge back in 1980. They didn't screen it for critics, so it kind of just went out there, and they advertised it very well. They advertised it as this sort of kind of circus where you're going to see all these creative murders, and no film had really been marketed in the sense of its gore. So this was the first time that had happened. So it had a great opening weekend, and it held all the way through the summer. It became the biggest horror hit of 1980. It outgrossed The Shining, it outgrossed Dressed to Kill, and all these other sort of more highbrow films. So it completely took its makers by surprise, and Sean Cunningham certainly did not expect this kind of level of success.
The first one, as you said, was done in an atmosphere of having a good time, low budget, makes a lot of money. Now it's the second one. How many of those people remained, and was there a lot of pressure to not only duplicate the success of the first one, but go even better?
The interesting thing about Friday the 13th is that it's very hard to make a sequel to a film where pretty much everyone has been killed. So even your main villain has died. So part 2 obviously needed a new villain. So through a lengthy sort of development process, they decided to make Jason, who was really only in the dream sequence in the end of part 1, the villain, the main villain. So the only people that really could return from the first film were Adrienne King, who was the star. She was the only one who survived. Jason himself returns, and then in a brief cameo, Betsy Palmer as Jason's mother returns. What they decided to do is they didn't want to bring back Alice and have her be the star again. They wanted fresh faces. But they wanted to bring her back in some capacity, so they created a sort of a prologue where Jason returns by killing Alice, sort of taking his revenge on the killer of his mother. And that sort of set up a template in future sequels, slasher films in general, where the main heroine of the previous film always kind of comes back to get killed off before the titles of the next one. So, so basically what Steve Miner wanted to do, because Steve Miner was elevated to the status of director for part 2, because Sean Cunningham did not want to return, Steve Miner really wanted to surround himself with kind of a group of people that were familiar, that he was comfortable with, and that were familiar with the first film. So a lot of the people in the first film, the crew members, were promoted on the sequel. The assistant cameraman on the first film became the director of photography. The still photographer on the first film became an assistant director. So there was sort of a sense that there's still a sense of camaraderie and fun, but there was a sense of pressure. I mean, I know Steve Miner definitely felt like he liked the structure of the first film. He liked the basic template, but he wanted to make it a little scarier, a little faster paced, a little better made. I mean, Friday the 13th had, Part 2 had a slightly higher budget. It was slicker, it was shot a little more professionally. They introduced the idea of a Steadicam. So there's a lot of roving POVs, and there definitely is a more polished look to the sequel. So, and in terms of the script, they decided that they weren't going to deviate too much from the formula of the first film. So basically the only thing new about Friday the 13th Part 2 is the killer is new. But you have people return to a camp that's been closed down, and they've been told to stay away, and one by one, they disappear. And then there's the final battle between the girl and the villain, and there's a big, kind of chair jumper ending. So all the basic same elements were there. It was just, quicker, faster, bloodier, scarier. That was sort of the mission, was we got to make Friday the 13th over again, but make it better.
Why didn't Sean Cunningham and Victor and all those others come back with the next project also?
Well, the interesting thing about Friday the 13th Part 2, the development of that film, is there's actually kind of a lot of different creative ideas that were bandied about. And the main one was from Sean Cunningham and Victor Miller. They felt that the name Friday the 13th was so potent that what they should do is create sort of an anthology series of films. So every year there'd be a new Friday the 13th film, but it would be a completely different story, different characters, different plot. And it would sort of, it would be kind of an annual kind of, celebration of the name. Unfortunately, the brass at Paramount and the backers in Boston really didn't gel with the idea. They felt they wanted the same thing, that they wanted to market basically, the same thing, only different. And Sean too, he was kind of, he was reluctant. He didn't want to repeat this. He made Friday the 13th. He didn't want to make it again. There was also some qualms in terms, especially from Victor Miller, as well as Tom Savini, who did not return either to Part 2 for the same reasons. They felt that it just didn't logically make sense that Jason would have been alive. He was supposed to have been a child that drowned and a figment of Adrienne King's imagination. So to make him a real creature just would defy credibility. So because of that, Sean Cunningham and Victor Miller and Tom Savini all opted out of Part 2. And Sean kind of took a backseat. He sort of cheerleaded Steve Miner and basically said, go make your movie.
Now what got cut?
The original Friday the 13th emerged relatively unscathed through the MPAA process, because at the time it wasn't notorious. So only maybe 8 or 9 seconds of the first one was cut. What happened was, after Friday the 13th came out and was so vilified by critics and the moral majority, is the MPAA got a real high amount of flack from people saying, hey, you shouldn't have let this movie slide through with an R. So beyond that point, they were very, very hard on slasher movies in general, and specifically Friday the 13th. Basically, it was kind of a revenge of the MPAA. So when Part 2 came around, they really loaded up with gore. They created even more elaborate murders, because they knew that's what people wanted to see. Unfortunately, they had to cut almost a minute of footage out of Part 2. So there are whole effect sequences that are just gone. There's sort of the centerpiece kill was supposed to be a scene where a couple is making love on a bunk, and Jason comes in and slides a spear through both their bodies and pulls it out again. And it's very elaborate. They built whole false bodies, and it was very disturbing apparently. And now all you see is literally this, Jason holding a spear, and you see the spear hit the ground, and the whole scene is just cut. So there's whole scenes where it just doesn't make sense. Like it seems cutty, it seems jumpy.
How about alternate endings?
When Part 2 came around, they had scripted an ending that was a bit more elaborate than what's seen in the final film. And it's actually been a source of confusion for fans for many years. The original idea was that Ginny, played by Amy Steele, and John Fury, who plays her boyfriend, are attacked by Jason in a cabin, and there's a struggle, and it kind of fades to white. Ginny wakes up, and she's in an ambulance, and she's asking, where's Paul? Where'd he go? And then you cut to a shot of Mrs. Voorhees' head on the altar, and it kind of zooms in, and the eyes open, and it smiles, basically signifying that Jason has killed Paul. Unfortunately, if they did film that ending, they hired a woman to kind of fit into this fake head through the altar. She opened her eyes and smiled, and unfortunately, it just looked silly. So they realized, well, we can't do that, but they already shot the film. So right now, it's kind of confusing. As Ginny wakes up and Paul's gone, and they zoom in on this head, and it just ends the credits. So there's been a lot of confusion. Is Paul dead? Did she dream that? So unfortunately, the original kind of ending never really quite came across. So, but the intention was that Jason had killed Paul and had escaped somewhere, and the evil of Jason and the legacy of Mrs. Voorhees is living on in the woods.
By the time number 3 came along, it had made its imprint on teenage horror films. What do you think was the lasting impact from the Friday the 13th series?
Well, I think Friday definitely has earned its place in the pantheon of horror films in general. I mean, Jason is now like Freddy Krueger and Michael Myers. He's a modern equivalent of Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman. He's our generation's boogeyman. Everyone knows, if you see a hockey mask and a machete, you know exactly what that means. You don't ever have to see a Friday the 13th movie. You know who Jason is. So because he's become iconic like that, I don't think he'll ever truly die. I mean, he's been repurposed in more films and a remake and novelizations. I mean, you go to Universal Horror Nights every year and there's a Friday the 13th maze, you know. I mean, Jason is a premier villain of our time. So as long as there's money to be made from Jason and Friday the 13th, he will survive.
Great. Well, thanks for coming. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome.